Christmas has officially come early. We have Christmas in May. For those of you in the CMMC world know that the streets have been buzzing today because NIST has released their initial draft of the NIST SP 800-171 Revision 3. All of us in the CMMC ecosystem, we've been waiting for this release just so we can have something new in our ecosystem, something that we can start reviewing and seeing, okay, what's the direction that the government is going in regards to cybersecurity and managing those non-federal systems that are processing, transporting, or storing CUI, that controlled unclassified information. So today we were given that gift by NIST. Thank you. I've pretty much spent all day doing a deep dive, reading all 103 pages of the initial public draft for the NIST SP 800-171 Revision 3. And it did not disappoint. NIST, you did a fantastic job. I'm really impressed. It is a vast improvement over version 2 of NIST SP 800-171. So I'm really impressed. It's not perfect, but hey, it's a draft, and we have public comments that are going to be open until July 14th. I'm certainly have some comments that I'm going to submit in hopes of doing my part as a certified CMMC provisional assessor and instructor. I want to do everything that I can to help make the Revision 3 a success for the defense industrial base. If you aren't a regulatory geek like myself and haven't read this initial draft yet, I highly encourage you to do so. But the purpose of this video is for me to give you my initial reaction, some key takeaways, changes, and if you decide not to read it, which I encourage you to do so, at least you'll have some good highlights from watching this video. I'll give you the cliff notes. So I do have a spoiler alert. I know for those of you in the defense industrial base, prime contractors, subcontractors, I know a lot of you, especially small businesses, were hoping that potentially that NIST would kind of lax the cybersecurity requirements or reduce them. I know many of you are struggling with fully implementing NIST SP 800-171 version 2, the current version. But the spoiler alert is that's not the case. NIST did increase the requirements, at least from my point of view. Based on my initial analysis, the requirements have been increased, although there are still 110 security requirements, just like in the current version. However, NIST has withdrew some of the requirements from the current version and essentially consolidated them with new requirements in this version 3. So it's just kind of a rearranging, but I like that they stuck with 110 requirements for that consistency. Overall, I would say that the requirements on the DIB to implement version 3 is going to be even greater than current version 2. The main reason I would say is because the requirements of version 3 are more prescriptive than version 2. The upside of it is clearer guidance, which will result in, I would say, greater compliance and a stronger security posture for the defense industrial base. However, the trade-off of that is, again, it's going to require more effort for the defense industrial base to fully implement all 110 practices for the version 3. It is more prescriptive. Now, as an assessor, I think that's a great thing from an assessor standpoint with it being more prescriptive. Also, as a business owner that has to adhere to security requirements, including this SP 800-171, I do like when the requirements are more prescriptive versus vague. However, you don't want to be overly prescriptive. And I think that NIST did a good job of balancing it, where they're not being overly prescriptive. They're just being just enough specificity to provide the guidance needed to understand what the requirements are. As I was reading through, some other initial reactions I had is it's definitely written in plain English. I like that. I like the format. It flows smoothly. They removed a lot of the technical jargon and regulatory jargon that we find in version 2. And in version 3, it's really well written. Thumbs up, NIST. Also, you'll notice some changes in the format. Probably my biggest initial reaction when I first started reading it, and then by the time I made it all the way to page 103, is there's a lot of ambiguity around FIPS validated cryptography. That's a huge pain point. I'll emphasize this big pain point for the defense industrial base because it's complex and it's hard to stay in compliance with those FIPS 140-2 cryptographic modules. as I read through this initial draft for version 3, one of the big things that stood out to me is that FIPS is not called out in the requirements. It's called out in the discussion section, which I'll talk more about later. But unlike in version 2, which calls it out in the actual requirement or practice, in version 3 it's not. It just says cryptography is required for CUI, whether in transit or in storage. That's a difference. So it seems like maybe NIST is moving away from specifying that FIPS 140-2 validated cryptography is required to protect the confidentiality of CUI. Maybe they heard all the gripes and complaints and screams from the defense industrial base and decided to maybe move away from that. But hey, to be determined. Definitely anxious to see where NIST lands on that topic once the final version is published. So some specific changes that NIST highlighted is that they increased the specificity for security requirements to remove ambiguity, improve the effectiveness of implementation, and clarify the scope of assessments. So I don't want to read that to you verbatim. And overall, I agree. They definitely did remove a lot of ambiguity. Again, they removed a lot of that technical jargon, regulatory jargon, and the requirements are clear. So someone that doesn't have a technical background can still read the requirement and understand, for the most part, what they need to do, what controls they need to implement to protect the confidentiality of CUI. Other changes include NIST, they've added titles to each security requirement. So in NIST SP 800-171 revision 2, which is the current version, there you just have the practice number. So 3.1.1, for example, and there's no title next to it, only at the control family level. But for this revision 3 in the draft, they've added titles to each of the 110 security requirements. So like remote access, wireless access, etc. I like that because it gives you more context. It lets you know, okay, this practice is related to this specific control family. And I think, again, that's removing ambiguity and giving more specificity. Speaking of the families, NIST added 3 new security requirement families. So we went from an existing NIST SP 800-171 version 2, there are 14 control families. However, in the initial draft of version 3, there are 17 control families. So NIST has added 3.15, which is planning, 3.16, system and service acquisition, and my favorite, 3.17, supply chain risk management. As a certified CMMC provisional assessor and instructor, I love supply chain risk management. So when I saw that, my eyes lit up, and yeah, NIST, you're speaking my love language with 3.7. One of the most notable changes for this initial draft of version 3 is the organizational defined parameters, the ODPs. NIST has introduced organization defined parameters, ODP, in selected security requirements to increase flexibility and help organizations better manage risks. So in theory, I like this. So having the ODP in select requirements allows organizations to make risk-based decisions on how they're going to satisfy the requirement, which that's a great thing. However, from an assessment standpoint, an application standpoint, I can see there being some confusion there or some abuse there as well, just because it allows for that subjectivity and not really a clear standard. So let's use patch management, for example. If organization, they take a risk-based approach and they say, okay, we're going to install critical patches within 30 days. Another organization taking this ODP approach to say, we're going to apply critical patches once a year. So you see, that's a huge difference. Policies, for example, organization may say, okay, we're going to review our policy at least once a year, which for essentially CMMC Level 2, it says, yeah, we need to do once a year. But taking this ODP approach in this version 3, organization can say, oh, we're going to do it every 3 years, review our policies. So that's where I see it being a gray area or some abuse. Now, NIST does give a caveat with the ODP. It states that the determination of organization-defined parameters can be guided and informed by laws, executive orders, directives, regulations, policies, standards, guidance, or mission and business needs. So translation, the DoD or the federal agencies can essentially implement parameters or minimums in relation to the organization defined parameters. But also NIST calls out, once specified, the values for organization defined parameters become part of the requirement. So I understand that as essential organizations can't just say, all right, yeah, this is our organizational defined parameter, but they're also going to have it documented, because then once they have it documented, just like when you write something in your policy, now it's part of the requirement. I do like that part in terms of, it needs to be written down. Okay, what are your organizational defined parameters? Keyword define. You need to document them. But it's going to be interesting to see what the Department of Defense does or the federal agencies do in regards to the organizational defined parameters. But again, in theory, I like it. Being an organization, being able to take a risk-based approach, not just that one size fits all for the requirements, really factoring in their size, the type of operations they're performing, location, etc. But there's still, I do believe there needs to be some safeguards, some guardrails up where this won't be abused. We'll see what happens. Another change is a discussion section that NIST has incorporated in this version 3 draft, where previously the discussion section was only included in the NIST SP 800-171 Alpha for version 2, which is the assessment guide. But now NIST is incorporating it into the actual publication directly. So the discussion section includes for each requirement. It provides that additional information to facilitate the implementation and assessment of the requirements, which is very useful. Important to know that NIST specifically calls this out. The discussion section is informative, not normative. So I understand that as, all right, it's just for your informational purposes to give you context, but it's not intended to extend the scope of a requirement or to influence solutions that the organization may use to satisfy the requirement. So that's when I talked earlier about being overly prescriptive. NIST doesn't want to be overly prescriptive where they're telling you, okay, what solutions to use or exactly how to implement the requirement. They're just giving you some context, some examples, and you can use it however you wish, but it's not extending the scope of a requirement. So just keep that in mind. And lastly, with the discussion section, again, it has examples, and the use of the examples is notional, not exhaustive. So just because you don't see an example listed doesn't mean that you can't try another method to satisfy the requirement. And then it's not reflective of potential options available to organization. Again, they don't want to get overly prescriptive, recommending specific solutions. NIST doesn't want to wade into those murky waters. They do want to provide the defense industrial base with as much context and guidance as feasible. Moving on to what I would classify as the most notable requirements, and this is my subjective opinion. I highlighted 3 out of the 110. I took a ton of notes, but there were 3 that I bolded because they really popped out to me as major changes from the current version to this initial draft of version 3. So the first one is 3.12.5, use independent assessors or assessment teams to assess controls. So I was really shocked to see this requirement in the publication. Not because I think it's a bad thing, I think it's a great thing, but I'm just not sure how it's going to align with CMMC. So obviously, CMMC, once it becomes a final rule, it does require the CMMC third-party assessment organizations, which fit into the category of independent assessor or assessment teams. I just got some questions around this one, but I think it's great that NIST has made this a requirement. So in reality, for all of the naysayers and people that believe that CMMC is never going to see the light of day, with 3.12.5 being a requirement in NIST SP 800-171 revision 3, if it makes it to the final version, then CMMC wouldn't even matter, because this requirement is calling out saying that, all right, it's a requirement that your organization controls are assessed by an independent assessor. So that's a pretty big deal. So if you think about in the commercial sector where requirements for like SOC 2 audit or ISO 27001, this is kind of along those same lines, requiring that independent assessor, not your internal employees, but someone that's independent, that doesn't have a conflict of interest, that didn't implement your controls. The same criteria essentially as CMMC Level 2. This is what 3.12.5 is requiring. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it all integrates with CMMC, and then also how other federal organizations enforce this requirement on their supply chain. But again, it seems like the federal government is moving towards more compliance, not less, as I know many of you in the DIB had hoped. So the second one on my top 3 list for most notable new requirements is 3.15.1, policies and procedures. So this one has the security requirements broken down to A and B. So A, to develop, document, and disseminate to organizational personnel the roles, policies, and procedures needed to implement security requirements, and B, review and update policies and procedures. And then the organization defines the frequency. That's an example of a requirement that has the organization defined parameter in it. This is a big one. So with the current version 2, policies and procedures are not a practice that's explicitly called out in the publication. You have to go down to Appendix E in the current version, the NFO controls, to see the policies and procedures that NIST essentially, when they were doing their tailoring, that they assumed that the defense industrial base already had in place. But now, there was a lot of complaints about that and confusion. But now with version 3, at least in this initial public draft, has responded and essentially has made this an explicit requirement to have documented policies and procedures. So that is another way where they're cutting out that ambiguity, they're making it clear, and streamlining the requirements. I really like that, because you have to have documented policies and procedures to really take a holistic approach to cybersecurity, to properly secure CUI and have that governance over your program. Policies and procedures have to be documented. Okay, to round out my top 3 most notable new requirements, again, it's just my opinion. I'm sure y'all might have your own top 3 lists, but these are the 3 that jumped out the most to me. And the third one is 3.16.3, external system services. So this one has a total of 3 requirements as part of this one. So A, B, and C. And A, require the providers of external system services to comply with organizational security requirements and implement the following controls. And then also the organization gets defined the controls. So that's another example of organizational defined parameter. And then for B, it says define and document organizational oversight and user roles and responsibilities with regard to external system services. Last but not least, C, implement the following processes, methods, and techniques to monitor, control compliance by external service providers on an ongoing basis. So this one's jumped out to me because, the NIST in this version, they're coming for those external service providers. So whether it's your cloud service provider, your MSP, your MSSP, your consultants, hey, they need to be compliant with the requirements of NIST SP 171 if they have access to that CUI, if they're processing it, storing and transmitting it. They need to be able to demonstrate to you as their customer they're following the flow down requirements. So in 3.16.3, NIST in this version, they're calling it out, and you're going to have a defined program for managing your supply chain risks. Just like the DoD or CMMC is managing their risks with their supply chain, it flows down. So you're going to have to manage the risks of your supply chain if you're giving them access or sharing that CUI with them. Those are my top 3, the using an independent assessor, policies and procedures, and then external services. So those are some big changes, at least from my perspective. Kind of wrap up my initial reactions with the appendix. So now for version 3, the NFO controls are located in Appendix C. And again, those NFO controls are controls that are used for the tailoring. They're not explicitly called out in the publication for security requirements, but NIST, when doing their tailoring from 800-53, they're assuming that there's a contractor that's processing, storing, transmitting CUI in non-federal systems. You already have these controls in place or meeting these security requirements. And my initial count, there were 20 NFO controls in Appendix C for version 3. So that's a lot. In addition to those 110 security requirements, 20 NFO controls, you need to address those as well. This version 3 is certainly not going to be easier to implement than the current version, but I do think it's clear guidance, and it's going to result in a stronger security posture for your organization to protect your own sensitive information, and then also protecting the government's controlled unclassified information. It's a win-win, really, but it's definitely going to be some work. It's not going to be easy. Last but not least, with the NFO controls in Appendix C, in this version, they introduced a new tailoring category, NA, so not applicable. All right, so before I close out this initial reaction video, I do want to share with you the public comments that I am going to submit to NIST for this initial draft before the public comments period closes July 14th. I encourage you to do the same. These are some of the requirements that I have some questions about. So 3.5.3, multi-factor authentication. The requirement says implement multi-factor authentication for access to system accounts. So to me, it's kind of vague. My question is, okay, are we saying that multi-factor authentication for all system accounts, including non-CUI accounts? So that's the part where it's not as clear to me, and I would like more clarification around what NIST is expecting with this requirement. The next one, 3.8.4, media marking. So this one has two requirements. Mark media containing CUI indicating distribution limitations, handling caveats, and security markings. Okay, that one's clear enough for me, but B is where I had some questions. So exempt, and then it mentioned assignment, organization defined type system media containing CUI. So this is an example of an organization defined parameter, but it says exempt from marking if media remain within the defined controlled areas. I've gone through the DoD mandatory CUI training twice. I've read the NARA CUI marking requirements, and I don't remember seeing anything related to CUI where it's really exempt. So that part I'm not quite clear on as far as the exemption. So my question is, okay, does this requirement comply with NARA marking guidance? So an example of exempt CUI media would be helpful. So I would like to see some more guidance around this one because it seems like it kind of conflicts with NARA guidance on marking CUI. Next one, 3.12.5, independent assessment. Told you I love this one as a certified CMMC provisional assessor. Yeah, I love this one, but it is I'm not quite clear on the specificity on this one. This being a requirement to use independent assessors or assessment teams to assess controls, does it mean all 110 controls that's in this revision 3? And then in that case, if someone's going through a CMMC Level 2 assessment being performed by a C3PO, is that current assessment, does that satisfy the requirement? It's a little fuzzy on that one, but again, I'm happy that they do have this requirement explicit in the publication, but I would like to see some more guidance pertaining to this requirement. Then 3.13.7, split tunneling. Prevent split tunneling for remote devices unless the split tunneling is securely provisioned using the organization-defined safeguards. So another example of an ODP. Now, so split tunneling, I know this is a big headache for a lot of contractors as well, implementing this one. However, I'm not quite clear on when they say, okay, organization-defined safeguards. It needs some more guidance around that. Really, this is more so a comment, like, okay, what are some examples of some organizational defined safeguards for split tunneling that will satisfy this requirement? Because when I look in the discussion section, it doesn't give any context about what do they mean by some safeguards for split tunneling. So I would like to see some examples with that one. Then the last one, 3.13.8, transmission and storage confidentiality. This one, the actual requirement says, all right, implement cryptographic mechanisms to prevent unauthorized disclosure of CUI during transmission and while in storage. So this, again, I pointed out earlier where some ambiguity around if FIPS 140-2 cryptographic mechanisms are going to be required. So in the current version, yeah, the practice especially states that FIPS 140-2 validated cryptography is required to encrypt CUI. However, in version 3, they mentioned it in the discussion section, but it's not mentioned in the requirement. And if you remember earlier, I pointed out where NIST highlighted that the discussion section is not intended to increase the requirement. So there's some gray area there, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that has this question, but I plan on submitting it during the public comment period. All right, well, that is my initial reaction, my kind of high level summary of some of the key changes, notable changes, and feedback for this initial draft of NIST SP 80171 Revision 3. Overall, I think NIST made substantial improvements over the current version, Revision 2, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the final version looks like when they publish it. If you have any questions or comments, I'll be certainly happy to hear from you. Let me know what you thought about this video and just your feedback after reading the initial draft.